All right, guys, I think you can see my slides. I've got recording on. I think I've done everything I need to do. So thank you for joining very much, whether you're live or watching the replay. We've got a ton of stuff to get through. I've got a real backlog of questions at the moment, so this is all Q&A today. We've got 10 questions in 30 minutes, so that's 3 minutes per question, so I'll do my best. If you like the look of any of this, then definitely stick around. I'm going to have extra time at the end for questions, so if you have a question, just type it into the chat box, or you can turn your mic on and ask. Okay, so let's start with Nick's question from last month. Last month we talked about foot perspiration, and Nick wanted to know whether there's any alternative to dry claw in Australia that has the 20% topical aluminium chloride hexahydrate. So I rang my local pharmacist and she said that it's not available at her suppliers. So I think it's just not available through pharmacy suppliers in Australia. But you can get it on Amazon and eBay, at least the last time I checked. So people can still get a dry claw on Amazon or eBay, but it's not available through chemists. Now, I asked if she knew why, and her lingering thought in the back of her mind was that it just didn't sell well in Australia, and so it's no longer bought in. Now, that could be completely wrong. It was just like a bit of a thought in the back of her mind. But, yeah, basically it's not available in Australia through pharmacies at the moment. Now, there are a couple of alternatives that are aluminium salts. Aluminium salts are good at being an antiperspirant. So there's No More Sweat, that is 20% aluminium dichlorohydrate. I don't know exactly how, I mean, it's different to obviously aluminium chloride hexahydrate. I don't really understand how much different it is. I don't know which of these is better than another. But you can get this through the online pharmacies like Chemist Warehouse and also from their own website, including in Australia. So that's nomoresweat.net. And then you've got the Rexona Clinical and Advanced Protection. This contains aluminium sesquichlorohydrate. Again, I don't know how much different it is or better or worse, but given that you can get it in supermarkets, it's probably a bit weaker in strength than the others, or at least the dry claw. On their official website, Rexona's website, it didn't have a percentage, but I did find on an alternative website, which I wouldn't take as gospel, it said it was a 20% of this aluminium sesquichlorohydrate as well. So look, Nick, I don't know if that helps an awful lot, but basically that's what's available in Australia in terms of the aluminium-based antiperspirants. If you guys want to see a replay of last month's office hours, which was all about foot sweat, then head over to pro.blisterprevention.com and go to the Learn tab and office hours. This is where we keep all the replays, so you can jump in there anytime to watch any replay that we've done. So I hope that helps. Sophia asked, what's the latest blister protection pads we should be recommending? Well, if I just take that what we should be recommending part of the question, Sophia, really whether it's a pad, a patch, a lubricant, a powder, a technique, whatever, it should be the thing that reduces blister causing shear at that anatomical location. So that's a very broad question. But if I take that question at face value, probably the latest product that's come on the market would be Pelitech pads. They've been around for a while now. I did a breakdown of the Pelitech pads. Let me just give you that link, because I did a video where I cut one in half and had a look at all the components, because there's 6 layers in a Pelitech pad. So you can have a look at that blog post. It's got a video there. And also I had a few of my customers who weren't getting on well with the Engo patches try these. And so you can see what their reviews were of it. If we think of other protection pads, perhaps Sophia, you're talking about gel products like gel toe sleeves and gel toe caps. I rate them very highly for the majority of toe blisters. Spenco, we have an evidence base for Spenco. We know that it helps prevent blisters and calluses on the plantar surface. And we could even put loose pack wool in this category of padding. There's not a lot of talk about how loose packed wool actually works. It happens to be a pretty popular product on the blister prevention website. So people are buying it and getting pretty good results with it. There are different brands. I stock one called Blister Wool. That's the brand name. It's Aussie made, so it's Tasmanian sheep, and the wool is milled in the oldest wool mill in Australia, which is in New South Wales, called Nundle Mill. But there's Hiker's Wool, ActiBliss, Wuru Wool as well. So there are a couple of options that you could look into. Sophia, when you're talking about the latest blister protection pads, if I think about something more that's just treating something very localized, you could be talking about Engo patches. Again, I rate them very highly, but by no means are they a padding. There's no thickness to them. They don't cushion. They are literally a friction reduction mechanism. And finally, a lot of our patients use hydrocolloids like Compeed as padding for a blister prone area. Hydrocolloids really shouldn't be used as a prevention. They should be used on wounds, which is basically a de-roof blister. If someone is, their activity level is pretty low, then of course, and a hydrocolloid may well give them effective blister prevention. But if there's any endurance component to their activity, definitely don't recommend hydrocolloids as a prevention padding, because it doesn't work very well as a prevention. And so we end up with a blister under the hydrocolloid. And then when you go to take that hydrocolloid off, it takes the blister roof off with it. So I hope that kind of helps, Sophia. But if this is all kind of foreign to you, then Blister Prevention University is a course that I built with Doug Ritchie that helps people understand all the different prevention strategies, how they work, what their pros and cons are, and what works best where, based on my experience, because there's just precious little of anyone really specializing in blisters. So yeah, I'd head over to Blister Prevention University. It's a course. I've got a link here. It's $299 US, which is about $460 AUD. Let me just pop this in the chat. It's approved by the Australian Podiatry Association. It's a very good course, in my humble opinion. Okay, Erica and Carly ask about double socks. So are 2 pairs of socks layered really better than a padded single pair? Well, let's have a look at that. But before we do, some examples of double socks. So you can literally just bung 2 pairs of socks together. Some people use the same sock. It works better when you use a very thin sheer nylon kind of close fitting sock for the inner sock, and then a standard athletic sock on the outer. Right socks are an example. Right socks are a brand of sock that you can buy. It's a single sock, but there's double layers sewn into the sock. So they can work fairly well as a double sock, I guess. I don't know much about the material composition. I feel like it's the same material for each sock, but it's just 2 layers of it. Armorskin socks are a really weird kind of a sock. We sell these on our site, and I rate them relatively highly for instances where I can't use Engo patches for friction management. So with Armorskin socks, the Armorskin sock is the inner sock, and you just pair it with any sock you want for the outer sock. They have a high friction inner surface, so much so that you can't pull the sock on. You have to kind of roll it on, and the outer is relatively slippery. So the double sock layer is kind of slippery. That's where we get any movement. Definitely not against the skin. And of course, Injinji toe socks are a double sock mechanism for the interdigital space. In terms of the evidence, well, the evidence is equivocal. So we've had one study that found that 2 double sock systems was better than a single sock. We have another study that found only 1 double sock mechanism worked better than a single sock, and a third study that found the single sock worked better than the double sock mechanism. However, it's important to understand that the material composition of these socks and their thickness will definitely affect the outcome, and it was very variable within these 3 studies. So there's nothing we can really hang our hat on, I'm afraid. If you want to know the references for each of those and read them more, I can direct you to our paper from earlier this year, the second paper in the Journal of Athletic Training, and yeah, it's all outlined there. So I hope that helps, guys. Hafsa asks, what's the best way to reduce sweating in the feet without using a potassium permanganate? Well, first off, I don't think there is any comparative studies of potassium permanganate versus something else, not that I know of anyway. But if we go to last month's episode of Office Hours, we talked about hyperhidrosis. And treatments include socks and ventilated uppers. Of course, they don't reduce the amount of sweat, they just manage the sweat. Then we've got, I guess, roughly in increasing order of effectiveness, we've got astringents. We know that astringents have a very short-term effect. They precipitate proteins that blocks the sweat ducts. So sweat is produced, it just can't get to the skin surface. Then we've got our topical aluminium chloride hexahydrate, which was the dry chlor, or the other aluminium salt antiperspirants. We've got iontophoresis. It's a bit of an ordeal. It's a bit of a process. Compliance is relatively low, but it's definitely something to let your patients know of because it's something that they can do at home. Oral anticholinergic medications. I don't actually know anyone that's taken these, but presumably they have a systemic effect. You need them on prescription, obviously. So they are something to let your patient know about. Botox injections, apparently the effect of that is between 6 months and 2 years. So if you're happy to go through that ordeal, that's definitely something that can work better than an astringent can anyway. And sympathectomy and local excision. So again, head back to last month's episode of Office Hours if you want to have a look at the more in-depth discussion about those. Jacqueline asks, what's the best treatment? The best treatment involves prevention, basically. So too often treatment is just first aid. It's just literally betadine and a Band-Aid. So it's the antiseptic and the dressing, and that's the end of it. But it shouldn't be the end of it because that's not really enough to stop the blister causing forces. And so that blister will still be very painful when you put your shoe back on and keep walking or running. And the blister will probably get worse as well. So meaningful blister treatment has to include the thing that actually stops the blister causing shear. Remember, blisters aren't caused by rubbing on the skin surface. So it's not good enough just to cover a blister. We have to actually do something to prevent the stretching and distortion in the skin and the soft tissues within our foot. If we quickly go through this, I guess, flow chart of blister treatment, and if we use the example of like a running event, so the idea is we start and finish blister free. To do this, we need to implement some sort of prevention to our likely blister areas. It is possible to predict blisters with some level of certainty. I would always just expect to get any blister I've had before, and also a blister anywhere where there's a callus, because calluses and blisters are caused by the same thing, that is repetitive shear deformation. So if we've got that under like the second met head, you can guarantee that if you increase your activity level, all of a sudden that will blister. If we don't do that well enough, we've got one last opportunity for prevention, and that is the hotspot stage. The problem with the hotspot stage is it needs people to stop and do something about it. Now, it's too easy to ignore it. There's many reasons why there's no point stopping when you feel a hot spot. If you're not actually carrying any gear with you, like if you're in a running event, like a marathon, there's no point because you're not carrying a blister kit. Where you're hiking, you are. But then there's external pressures of you've got people with you that are hiking, you don't want to hold them up. You've got to get to point B before the sun goes down or something. So there's just too many reasons for the hotspot stage not being as helpful as it could be. So if we don't jump in and do something about it at the hotspot stage, the next thing we get is a blister with his roof intact. The good thing about this blister is he can't get infected if the roof remains intact. So in its simplest form, the aim of the game is to keep it intact. Therefore, we need to protect it with a dressing, like a Band-Aid, because remember, the skin that has bubbled up, it's lost its support from underneath, so it's quite fragile. So we need to cover it with something, but then we also need to implement the blister prevention plan for the anatomical site, because the Band-Aid isn't going to do enough to stop the blister causing forces. So again, we need prevention at this stage of treatment. Now, if we don't do enough here, then the next thing that happens is the roof will tear, and now we've got the risk of infection. So we need to add antiseptic to the equation, plus the dressing. That is the first aid for the blister. Plus, if we want this blister to feel better and not get worse as we continue to walk or run, we need to implement the prevention that we have planned for this anatomical site so that it doesn't get worse. Now, if we don't do enough here, the next thing that happens is the blister will de-roof. And when it de-roofs, we've got a larger surface area for infection. We need the antiseptic still for preventing infection, and the dressing. Now, de-roof blisters are the ones that we can use hydrocolloids on. Hydrocolloids need a wound base to be able to do their thing. So either a Band-Aid or, just an island dressing or a hydrocolloid at this stage. But still, we need to implement prevention, because if we just put the dressing on and keep going, that blister will get larger in surface area. It will continue to weep and just get worse, and it certainly won't feel better. So that's the gamut of blister management essentially in one short little handout. You can actually get this handout from our free CPD course. It's on the course website. What it is basically a webinar replay of a presentation I did about taping, all the pros and cons and the evidence base for taping. And part of that is also this free download. Let me give you that link. Hang on. Free CPD. Okay, moving on. Danielle asks, how do I prevent blisters on digital apices? I love it when people ask me about blisters specific to an anatomical site. So thank you, Danielle. A lot of our patients just assume that apical blisters are caused by their toes hitting the end of the toe box. That is not usually the case. I mean, it can be if the shoes are too short to start with. If the shoes are perfectly sized but our laces are too loose and the toes are at the end of the toe box, that can be causative. And also if there's a lot of downhill terrain. But more likely it's caused by digital clawing. So if there is a mechanical reason that you can isolate and you can manage in terms of biomechanics, definitely do that. But even with that, or even just on its own, toe props are the way to go. So Ottoform K toe props, you'll get a bit of pushback from runners. They don't like the idea of something under their toes while they're running, but they go fine. There's a few people that don't go well with them, but that's just the same with any sort of patient population. I find that they work really well. In the 6-day ultramarathons I go to, I use felt a lot for toe props because I don't have time to do the Ottoform K, and they also work really well. And it's quite an eye-opener for the runners. If toe props for some reason aren't an option, then the gel toe caps can be really good. The gel material absorbs blister causing shear really, really well. That's why it can be really effective. The thing that will let the gel toe caps down is if the nail is very long and thick and it sort of bites into the gel, because it's under weight bearing load basically. So there's the bottom of the shoe, the nail, and the gel in between. So it can really degrade the gel really quickly. But yeah, it's toe props, and have a look at mechanics and do what you can in terms of why those toes are clawing. Cheers, Danielle. Will ask, what's best practice for blister prevention in 2025? Well, I don't know about 2025. I also don't really know about 2024. But if I was to give you an answer for this, if we at least look at the evidence base, well, as it stands, there's evidence for the use of strategies that allow adaptive skin changes, including a familiarity with footwear and the activity. That's been proven to be helpful. There's an evidence base for Spenco insoles, and there's an evidence base for densely padded acrylic socks. And this was the work of Herring and Ritchie back in the early 1990s when they compared two identically constructed socks. One was 100% cotton, the other was 100% acrylic. And when both socks were very thin, neither had an advantage. When they were both densely padded, the acrylic far outperformed the cotton. So that could be that it could be because of a mechanism of moisture wicking, maybe. So maybe for moisture wicking to work, we actually need thickness. But it could also be that it reduces pressure. That could be a blister prevention mechanism. And also it could undergo shear itself, thereby there's less shear that happens within the skin. So yeah, that's where the evidence is. We have evidence that does not support the use of antiperspirants, as they do not reduce blister risk, and talcum powder, as it either has no effect or it increases blister risk. And as we've seen, there's equivocal evidence for double socks, so we really don't know which way or the other. And paper tape, we've had two studies. One found that it helped, one found that it didn't help. We don't have any studies on any other types of tape. Unfortunately, there's no evidence for many of the preventions in popular use, or even the ones that I recommend and really rely on. So there's nothing that says that aspects of good shoe fit is helpful in blister prevention, but intuitively we kind of know that it does. There's nothing for Engo blister patches. I mean, there is lab research that has measured coefficient of friction, and we know that it keeps very low coefficient of friction even when damp, as well as dry, but nothing in the field in terms of blister incidents. There's nothing for gel toe devices. There's nothing for toe props, nothing for orthoses or gait alterations, when we know that shear all starts from bone movement within the foot in the presence of high friction levels, keeping the skin surface stationary. So intuitively, orthoses and gait alterations will be helpful for some blister locations, but we don't have an evidence base for it. There's nothing for taping other than the paper tape, and there's nothing even for lubricants, and that's probably the most commonly used prevention strategy. So, Will, if you ask about what my thoughts are on best practice, it would be, first of all, consider the anatomical location of the blister and think about how the bones are moving and what's creating the shear deformation. And then, if we have an understanding of how all the preventions work, then you can apply the prevention to the anatomical location, and then nuance it for things like the shoe that they're wearing, the activity that they're in, etc. Every blister that I get, no matter where it is, I go through this in my head and I think, can I do that? Can I do that? Can I do that? Can I do that? What's the best combination? What's the best singular prevention that I can implement? So that is the best way to go, I feel. Too often people have one strategy in mind for all blisters. It's not that easy. We really have to think about the anatomical location. And if we could literally start thinking about blisters not so much as a superficial to deep wear injury, but as a shear deformation injury, then it does help you look at blisters a little bit differently. Now, if all of this is completely foreign to you and news to you and sounds all a bit too much, then head over to Blister Prevention University. That's what this is built on. It goes through all of the anatomical locations. I tell you about sort of what the reasons are for blisters there and which preventions work best for each one. And I go through all the preventions and tell you how they work, what their pros and cons are, etc., and their evidence base. I give you, yeah, I gave you that link. All right, far out, a bit behind. Yeah, this is Doug and my paper. I've given you the link for that one in the chat, so you can have a look through that for a bit of an overview. And ask, what other methods are there out there for prevention? Well, there's a ton. There's a few that I could rattle off quickly. And I don't really know what you're asking on me, but if you really want to understand blister prevention strategies better, the best place for that information is Blister Prevention University. So head over there and enroll in that course, and I give you all the things that you could basically possibly want to know, plus you get access to me and Doug if you've got any questions. David asked, to pop or not to pop? Great question. We actually did a whole episode of office hours on this. The reasons not to pop a blister is it can't get infected. So that's a pretty good reason to not pop it, yeah? Also, if your patient doesn't have the gear or the expertise, or it just freaks them out too much that they're cutting the skin, they think it's going to hurt, which it doesn't. Again, good reasons to leave a blister intact. Obviously, if they have health issues, that means that infection is a really, really big risk. Another good reason not to lance it. However, there's good reasons to lance a blister, because if we just ignore it, they often tear spontaneously in the grubby in-shoe environment. So if we take the bull by the horns and open that blister in a clean and controlled environment, that can be a better way to go. Blisters often worsen without intervention. Now, I've put a caveat here that really the intervention is not the lancing of the blister. The intervention is implementing the prevention to stop the blister causing forces. So that is the intervention, but lancing the blister can be kind of used as an adjunct. If a blister is particularly taut, it can reduce discomfort. We're putting a small breach in the blister roof rather than de-roofing the whole thing, which will tend to happen if we don't do anything. And also, when there's a lot of fluid in there, some of that will reabsorb, but some of it won't, and it'll crystallize and that'll become an irritant. So that's a good reason to pop a blister too, if it's very filled with fluid. Head over to office hours replays to have a look at that episode. We had pictures of blisters. We went through different scenarios and discussed whether we'd leave it intact, whether we'd lance it, or whether we'd actually de-roof it. And yeah, that was actually a pretty good episode. And finally, Miriam asks, is Hypafix tape a good option? Well, in terms of tape, as we know, we've only had the 2 studies, but they were for paper tape, so we don't have anything on fixation tape. I do want to mention that blisters are not caused by rubbing on the skin, so it's not as easy as choosing the best tape, covering the skin, and therefore we won't get a blister. If I put tape on here and the bone, I keep walking and the bones are moving back and forth, then shear is still happening in that skin and soft tissue. So it's not as easy as just picking the right tape. The good thing about Hypafix is it has good adhesion even in wet conditions. It's flexible, so it's really great to put on toes and anywhere that's sort of curvy. But if we think about blister prevention and the way tape works, which is to spread shear load, theoretically a rigid tape will work a bit better than a flexible tape. I want to just refer back to this. This is how tapes work. They spread shear load. You'll notice that nowhere here is there anything that says stopping rubbing on the skin. And in fact, reducing friction force by either reducing pressure or pairing materials that are more slippery, these actually increase rubbing. So they allow the skin to move in sync with the bone at an earlier moment in time with each shear distortion, and that reduces the magnitude of the shear distortion. So rubbing is not really the focus here. Yeah, so on the free CPD course, as I mentioned, we went through taping, all the ins and outs of it. So if you really want to know about taping, whether you want to stick with taping, how confident you can be that it helps, then definitely watch that webinar replay. But I also did an overview. I tested a bunch of fixation tapes. I think there were 12 of them, and wanted to compare them against Fixable, which I think we would agree is the best of the best. And so there's a video there that showed all the testing I did. It's not very scientific, so, but it's something to maybe guide you on as to the best fixation tape. So yeah, go and have a look at that. I hope that helps, Miriam. If you'd like any more info on that, then just let me know. So yeah, that's basically it, guys. These are the questions that we've covered. Has anyone got any questions? Do you want to type them in the chat or pop your microphone on and we'll get to them? All right, guys. Well, thanks for joining me. I will catch you next month for blister prevention office hours, the first Wednesday of the month. See you then.